Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world or whatever time you'll be watching this video. So guys, Ontario has just social assistance. But who just lost access to welfare? Well, Ontario has just changed the rules governing provincial social assistance, and the reason has everything to do with immigration status. Effective immediately, the Ford government says people who are living in Canada illegally will no longer be eligible for Ontario Works or the Ontario Disability Support Program, or ODSP. But there's another part of this story that could affect more people than the headline suggests. Ontario is also excluding people who are legally in Canada but are here only on a temporary basis, including people with student visas and work permits. So what exactly changed? Who is affected and who isn't? And why did Ontario make this change now? Because this story actually began with one controversial Ontario tribunal decision involving a man who had lived in Canada for decades after his temporary work permit expired. And that decision exposed a surprising gap in the wording of Ontario's welfare rules. Now let's break it down. Welcome back to the Social Spectator. Today we're looking at a major change to Ontario's social assistance system. Ontario says the new regulations are designed to ensure taxpayer-funded social assistance goes to people who are legally authorized to live in the province. The government amended regulations under both the Ontario Works Act 1997 and the Ontario Disability Support Program Act 1997. According to the province, the changes take effect immediately. Children, Community and Social Services Minister Michael Parsa said taxpayer-funded social assistance should not go to people living in Canada illegally. But before we get into politics, let's establish exactly what the province changed. There are two major categories to understand. First, people who are in Canada without legal immigration status, and second, people who are legally in Canada but are authorized to remain only temporarily. The province specifically identifies people with student visas and work permits among those who are no longer eligible for provincial social assistance under the new rules. Visitors and tourists are excluded. This is an important distinction. Someone with a valid study permit or work permit isn't necessarily in Canada illegally. They may be completely lawfully present. But Ontario's new social assistance rules distinguish between people who have a temporary authorization to remain and people whose status gives them a longer-term basis for provincial assistance. So this is not accurately described as Ontario has banned immigrants from welfare. That is too broad. Permanent residents, Canadian citizens, and other categories recognized under provincial eligibility rules are not suddenly being removed from Ontario's social assistance system simply because they're immigrants. The change is specifically about immigration status and eligibility, and that's where the controversy gets interesting. To understand why Ontario acted now, we have to go back to a tribunal case reported in July. The case involved a man whose identity was not publicly disclosed in the tribunal decision. According to reporting on the case, he came to Canada in 1997 on a temporary work permit. The permit was valid for 4 years, but when it expired, he remained in Canada. He eventually lived in Canada for more than 2 decades without legal immigration status. According to the tribunal record, as reported by the National Post, he supported himself through cash-paying jobs until 2023 when he entered the homeless shelter system. He later applied for Ontario Works. His application was denied because he did not have legal immigration status. But the case went to the Ontario Social Benefits Tribunal, and that's where the problem emerged. Under the rules that existed at the time, the legislation did not simply say anyone without legal immigration status is automatically excluded. Instead, the regulation identified specific categories of people who were ineligible because of their status. Those categories included tourists, visitors, and people subject to certain deportation, departure, exclusion, or removal orders. The tribunal therefore had to interpret those words, and the adjudicator concluded that this particular man did not fit the definition of a tourist or a visitor. Why? Because of the extraordinary length of time he had lived in Canada and the roots he had established here. There was also no evidence before the tribunal that he had an enforceable removal or deportation order. The result? The tribunal overturned the denial and declared him eligible for Ontario Works under the rules then in force. Now, that decision immediately triggered a political reaction. Premier Doug Ford publicly rejected the idea that someone living illegally in Canada should receive provincial social assistance. Ford said his government would support people who fall on hard times, but not people living in Canada illegally. He then indicated that if Ontario's regulations needed to be changed to make that distinction explicit, his government would change them. And now it has. The government has moved from saying it would consider a regulatory change to actually putting the new rules in place. And that's the central development we're reporting on today. But, as usual, there is a bigger issue underneath this political fight. Ontario's social assistance system is not the same thing as Canada's immigration system. Immigration is primarily a federal responsibility. Ontario administers provincial social programs such as Ontario Works and ODSP. So what Ontario has done is not a new immigration law. Ontario has changed the eligibility rules for its own provincial benefits, and that distinction matters. A person can be legally present in Canada and still be ineligible for a particular provincial benefit, and someone can be physically present in Canada without having valid immigration status. Those are two different questions. The first question is, are you legally allowed to be here? The second is, do you meet Ontario's requirements for this specific social assistance program? Ontario's new rules are making immigration status much more explicit in answering the second question. Now, what about international students? And this is where the headline could easily become misleading. International students are legally in Canada when they have valid authorization to study. Temporary foreign workers can also be legally present when they have valid authorization. But Ontario says people who are authorized to remain in Canada only temporarily, including people with student visas and work permits, are not eligible for Ontario social assistance under the new rules. That doesn't mean their immigration status has suddenly become illegal. It means they don't qualify for these provincial income support programs. And that's an important distinction for viewers to understand. If someone sees a social media post saying Ontario just made international students illegal, that would be false. Ontario has not done that. If someone says Ontario just made all immigrants ineligible for welfare, that would also be misleading. The actual issue is the eligibility criteria for provincial social assistance based on immigration status. Another major question is ODSP. The Ontario Disability Support Program provides income support and other benefits to eligible people with disabilities. The new regulations also amend ODSP eligibility. That means the change isn't limited to Ontario Works. And that's significant because someone can be dealing with a serious disability while also having temporary immigration status. Ontario's position is that provincial social assistance should be reserved for people who meet the province's eligibility requirements and have an immigration status that qualifies. The government has not said that every non-citizen is being removed from ODSP. Again, status matters. The government's announcement specifically targets people without legal status and people authorized to remain only temporarily. This is probably the most important fact check in the entire history. A lot of social media commentary is portraying the tribunal decision as if an adjudicator simply decided that illegal immigrants should receive welfare. That's not really what happened. The tribunal was interpreting the legislation that existed at the time. Ontario's regulations specifically excluded certain groups. The controversy arose because the legislation did not expressly say every person without legal immigration status is automatically ineligible. The tribunal interpreted the categories that were actually written in the regulation. The adjudicator concluded that the man did not fit the definitions of tourist or visitor and did not have an enforceable removal order. Therefore, under the wording then in place, he qualified. Whether you agree with that interpretation, it is a political and legal question. But the factual point is important. The tribunal was applying the rules that existed. Ontario's response was essentially, if that isn't the policy we want, we need to change the rules. And that is what the government has now done. Now, the Ford government's argument is straightforward. Taxpayer-funded social assistance is intended to provide a safety net for eligible people experiencing financial hardship. The government says people who have no legal right to remain in Canada should not receive that safety net. The government also argues that temporary residents, including international students and temporary workers, came to Canada under temporary arrangements and therefore should not rely on provincial income assistance. That argument will resonate with people who believe immigration programs should come with clear financial responsibilities. But there is another side to this debate. Critics can argue that social assistance exists precisely because people can experience extreme hardship. Someone's immigration status does not necessarily tell you whether that person is hungry, disabled, homeless, or otherwise vulnerable. And there are complicated situations involving refugee claims, humanitarian applications, family members, and people whose immigration circumstances are changing. Ontario's own existing policy directives have historically recognized that some people with complicated immigration situations can qualify for assistance under particular circumstances. So the question becomes, should social assistance eligibility depend primarily on financial need and vulnerability? Or should lawful immigration status be a fundamental condition of access? Ontario has now made its answer much clearer. For provincial social assistance, immigration status matters, And in the categories covered by these new regulations, temporary status is not enough. But here's some uncomfortable questions that both sides of this debate need to answer. What happens to people who lose access to social assistance but remain physically present in Ontario? If someone has no income, no family support, and no access to provincial welfare, they don't simply disappear. They may turn to shelters, food banks, charities, community organizations, hospitals, or informal employment. And those services can also have costs. The government may argue that removing social assistance eligibility creates an incentive for people to leave Canada when they no longer have legal status. Critics may argue that the financial burden could simply shift somewhere else. At this point, however, we need to be careful. The Ontario government has not provided evidence showing exactly how many people will lose benefits because of this change. So claims about enormous savings to taxpayers would be speculation unless the government releases actual numbers. And this is an important fact check. So let's quickly clear up several misconceptions. Number one, this does not mean every immigrant in Ontario has lost access to social assistance. That is false. Number two, this does not mean every person without Canadian citizenship is excluded. False. Permanent residents are immigrants, but citizenship and immigration status are not the same thing. Number three, this does not make international students or temporary foreign workers illegal. That is false. The issue is their eligibility for provincial social assistance. Number four, this does not mean Ontario has taken over immigration enforcement. It hasn't. Immigration enforcement remains largely a federal responsibility. And number five, this change did not happen randomly. It follows directly from the controversy surrounding the Ontario Social Benefits Tribunal decision involving a man who had lived in Canada for decades after his temporary work authorization expired. So, what should Canadians take away from all this? Ontario has now made a significant change in its social assistance eligibility rules. People living in Canada without legal immigration status are excluded. People whose authorization to remain is only temporary, including people with student visas and work permits, are also excluded from Ontario's social assistance programs under the new rules. The government's argument is that taxpayer-funded welfare should be reserved for people who are legally entitled to remain in Canada and meet the province's other eligibility requirements. The controversy began when an Ontario tribunal interpreted the previous rules and found that a man living in Canada without legal status was eligible because he didn't fall within the specific exclusion categories then written into the regulation. Ontario's response was to change the rules. Whether you think that is common sense or a dangerous policy change ultimately depends on where you stand on the relationship between immigration status, social assistance, and the government's responsibility to vulnerable people. But one thing is clear, the rules are no longer as ambiguous as they were when that tribunal case was decided. And the next question is going to be whether these new rules survive legal challenges and how Ontario will actually enforce them in practice. We'll be watching closely. If you want fact-check Canadian news without the social media spin, subscribe, like, and share to The Social Spectator. And tell us in the comments, should provincial social assistance require legal immigration status, or should financial need be the deciding factor? Just keep the conversation respectful. I'm Social Spectator. Thanks for watching.